Welcome into the checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
Today, we're jacking into the mainframe. Or something. Hollywood and your local news seem to know like 4 terms, maybe, for technology, or 5. We're mostly off the information superhighway now, which is pretty cool. I mean, it was a fun ride, but it's also a little 90s. Seems like everything bad that happens is the result of hackers writing a virus, except that's not really how it is. There was some sort of sloppy reporting recently that had a family member of mine telling another family member about this gigantic hack that hit Apple, which of course didn't actually happen. It was just, somebody half listening to a half written story on a local newscast delivered in the 45 seconds between weather and sports that led to honestly a panic on the part of this one family member of mine. So the question is, do you need to know the proper terminology for the various pitfalls you may encounter online? And I would say the answer is not necessarily. But being familiar may keep you from freaking out when freaking out is totally unnecessary. And it may be even more important, it can help you from keeping that aunt, uncle, or other family member from freaking out when freaking out is not necessary. So today we are doing part 1 of a 2-part episode, Demystifying Malware, Types and Terminology. On the checklist today, what is malware? Why are there so many different types of security threats? Spotting the differences in types of malware. And finally, we'll start at the beginning with a brief history of malware. But let's start with the definition. What is malware?
Well, malware is pretty much a catch-all term for security threats. There are a lot of different categories when it comes to the different types of security threats, and sometimes determining the difference between them can get a bit blurry. So it's a good idea to have a term that can just generically say this is a bad program, describes all the different types of threats in one fell swoop, and that term is malware. So what does it actually mean? Well, there are a couple terms that you might be familiar with. Hardware, your physical computer or laptop. Software, programs that run on your computer. And in the same vein, malware is short for malicious software, which is software that does bad stuff to your computer. So having a generic term in place, we can describe all the different sorts of security threats and basically figure out why there's a reason to have all these different terms, why we can't just say everything's a virus or malware.
But the one thing that you can say about all malware is that it is actually malicious intent. Intentionally malicious, I guess, is the way. This is not like, there's a glitch in an operating system that's causing things to crash. This is somebody has done something.
Exactly. There's a malicious intent behind it. It's not an accident or something, a bug. There's a reason. It was created for bad purposes.
So then getting to, as you say, everything is not a virus necessarily. Why do we have, if there's one terminology or one term for malware, then why are there so many different types of security threats?
Well, yeah, it's one of those things where there's so many different terms being thrown around, and it can be confusing. And some people think it's easier just to call everything a virus. But there's some important reasons that the different types of malware are defined and named differently. Primary reason being that different threats have different capabilities and can do different things to harm your computer. Some of those threats have a larger impact on your security. Some of them aren't as much of a problem. So knowing the difference between them, you can tell which ones might pose more of a risk to your personal security on your computer. Antivirus vendors are pretty specific when it comes to labeling a given piece of malware as a certain type. Then the news organizations are kind of a bit more hit or miss when it comes to accuracy. So, the end result is you have people saying, it's a virus attacking my computer, or, Macs don't get viruses. Mm-hmm. But there are really specific differences between the different categories for their capabilities and the reasons why they're named different things instead of calling them all a virus. So having knowledge of what those different types of malware can do can give you a better idea of what's a major problem or what's something you could maybe ignore or not freak out about. so much.
And I know I said earlier, so it would be good to know some of this stuff so that maybe you don't freak out, or so maybe you can keep somebody else from freaking out. It's also good, though, to know, to have at least a working knowledge so that you also don't get taken. I mean, because there are reputable firms out there that will sell you, good security suites, I suppose, good security solutions. And then there are less than reputable firms out there that will try to scare you into spending as much money as you possibly can on stuff that may never actually be a concern for you whatsoever. So, I mean, there's it's more than just knowing. What did G.I. Joe used to say? Knowing is half the battle, I guess.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
You can make sure you're well equipped going through, which I know we say every week, in your digital life. But what we also say every week is the difference between life and your digital life is whether you're looking at a screen while it happens. And it seems like more and more of us are. So let's talk about the different types of malware that are out there.
There's all different classifications for the type of malware. One of the first ones that we're going to talk about is adware. As the name suggests, it's all about advertising. This is one of the more common ones out there that people run into. Specifically, crooks use adware to make money from fraudulent use of online ad networks. So while you're surfing the internet, you may get pop-ups that tell you you need to install some sort of browser extension or toolbar. Usually when these type of malwares are installed on your computer, it starts collecting data on you. It starts injecting ads on you, changing your cookies, doing things that make it so the crooks who are behind this malware are making money off of you. So if you have some sort of toolbar or extension installed and you're surfing Amazon or any other site where there's e-commerce or money to be made off of it, they could be injecting code in there where they're making money off of you when you're doing your purchases or just surfing the internet, seeing different advertisements.
One of the things to note there is that when they're making money off of you, that's usually abusing what are called affiliate programs online. iTunes has an affiliate program, for example, where you set up your affiliate account and you use your affiliate code and you promote an app or a piece of music that's in one of the app stores, and somebody purchases it after clicking your link on your site or whatever, you'll get a small share of that sale from Apple. Google has affiliate programs. Pretty much everybody has them these days. So Adware will basically kind of inject their own affiliate codes into everything it can. So anytime you're purchasing something online or clicking an ad, their affiliate code is what's being flagged by whatever system as the one that should be paid, even if it wasn't, the one that should be. So those are kind of the underhanded ways they're working to make money off of your web surfing and online purchases.
Okay, that sounds nefarious, but I mean, let me ask you, and I don't mean to sound, mercenary about it, I suppose. This sounds like it's a bad thing for Amazon. This sounds like it's a bad thing for Google. How is this a bad thing for me?
It's much... yeah, you're exactly right there. It's ad fraud and click fraud. Those kind of related things are bigger concerns for the larger companies who are the ones who are actually losing money on it. Adware is definitely more kind of on the annoying level than a security threat. I guess a more serious security threat level. Mm-hmm. There is some adware that will watch all your web traffic as you're surfing the web. So it's kind of like more of a privacy concern, I'd say. But it's definitely not on the level of ransomware or something that's stealing your files. It's much more of a annoyance than an actual real concern. But obviously, it can slow down your computer and cause all sorts of other annoyances, the pop-up ads or anything like that. So it's still something you probably don't want running on your system.
Now, one that does, scare sort of it gives me the heebie-jeebies, I guess would be a good way to say it, is the next one up on the list that you guys have, keyloggers.
Keyloggers are interesting. Basically, they sit silently on your computer, recording everything that you're typing. So let's say that you're typing an email or logging into your bank account or transmitting any other data via a form or any application for that. It's recording everything that you're typing. And a lot of keystroke recorders out there will send those logs to the attackers. So all of your confidential data that you've put in there, your social security number while applying for that new car, all those things that are being typed into your keyboard are being sent to somebody else.
So basically what you're saying is every single thing that you type can be sent off to somebody else. And if you're talking about, well, an email to my mom, what do I care about that? Except I may have typed in the password to get into my email account. There's all kinds of information. Basically, any word or any combination of keys that you type, somebody could be collecting.
Exactly. And if you're on a public terminal, you're at a cyber arcade or at a library, and you're logging on to websites, checking your email, you're doing any transaction, you have to be aware that something else could be recording everything that you're typing. So it's good to keep that in mind.
That's one very good reason I never use those, the business kiosks at hotels that have a computer for you to use. Maybe I'll check into my flight if I just have to enter confirmation code, but I'm not logging into my email with those or typing any of my account information or passwords, because you have no idea what anybody's installed on those systems, and they're usually not a good idea to trust them.
I got to say, with your use of the term cyber arcade, you may have a future in writing for local news.
Hey, cyber has been a big keyword right there. So if you're not saying the word cyber, at least every other sentence, you're not hip.
Yeah, we'll have you jacking into the mainframe in no time. Let's talk about another. This is actually a bit of malware that we've heard more about, it seems, over the past year or so. Ransomware.
Okay, well, keyloggers, just to step back a second, they run silently. You don't know they're on your system. You don't know they're stealing your data. Mm-hmm. Ransomware, on the other hand, is very, very obvious that it's on your system. It will basically use encryption to lock all of your files, block access to them for your photos, your documents, anything important. And I'll put up a message on the screen saying, hey, your files are locked. We have the key. If you pay us some money, we'll give you the key. Otherwise, we're going to delete the key in 3 days, and you'll never have your files again. So it's very obvious when it's on your system. It's an emerging threat that is being taken advantage of by criminals worldwide on a larger scale these days, and it's only going to get worse. They're taking advantage of strong encryption technology. It makes it fast and easy for them to encrypt all your files so you can't open them. And it makes it very, very hard to try and crack the code that unlocks those files, which is basically why the extortion works. It's easier for a lot of people to pay the bad guys and hope they'll send them the unlock code than it is to lose all their files. And if you don't have up-to-date backups, there was a hospital in the news fairly recently that paid an enormous amount of money to some ransomware crooks because they didn't have any backups, and ransomware had locked all of their patient files. So it's definitely a real-world issue, and one that is more likely to be seen these days than some of the other categories of malware that are out there.
This seems like that honestly seems like one of the most terrifying that we've heard about in a while, because, okay, somebody gets in touch with me and they say, I've locked up everything you've got, but for $50, and it's not going to be as little as $50. But for $50, I'll go ahead and unlock all your stuff. Okay, first of all, as you say, so I pay the money, and then I just cross my fingers that they're actually going to, send me the code to unlock it. But then the other issue is, how do I know I don't get a similar email the following week?
And that's very possible.
Exactly.
Thanks. Okay, sleep tight, everybody.
Not trying to scare you there, but when you're dealing with criminals, you have that risk. So at what point, do you revert back to your backups, assuming you have them, clean backups, that is, and then whatever method that they obtain access in the first place, assuming that you could get that patch before they regain access into the system again. I mean, it's a cat and mouse game, and businesses on one hand think, well, if I pay them the money, then you have that whole good faith. But we're talking about extortion here in the first place, so right. How much is good faith worth?
Right. And it's one of those reasons that, on almost every episode here, we're saying make backups, make 2 sets of backups, keep one away from the rest of your backup. There's a good reason we frequently recommend it as a good practice, because this is one of those times where if you have, your recent backup, you might lose a day's worth of work on your computer or an hour's worth of work. It's not the end of the world. If you don't have any backups and you don't want to pay the criminals, or you pay them and they don't give you the key, that's a much larger problem. So make backups before bad stuff happens, be it ransomware or anything else.
And the mentality of, okay, well, I'm not a hospital, why would they come after me? Well, that $50 times however many vulnerable computers are out there all add up. So it's not necessarily that they're gonna attack you specifically, but you may be vulnerable to the type of attack that they're able to get in through, and you're just a number in the system. So make those backups.
I actually believe the going rate these days is somewhere between $300 and $400 actually, and it's only payable in Bitcoin. So you have to, take the extra steps to purchase Bitcoin and then send it to them, and that's how they, try and get away without anybody tracing where the money went. So it's a huge headache all around.
And you make an interesting point. You made an interesting point a moment ago, and one that we made a few weeks ago, I think. Do you think to yourself, well, who am I? Who's going to target me? And the answer may well be, well, I mean, you're a very special person in your own way. I mean, we're all special snowflakes, but you're nobody to the hacker. It's a numbers game, or to the malware author, let's say. It's a numbers game. They try to infect as many systems as they can. When you then contact them and say, hey, unlock my computer, hey, now they know that they've actually locked your computer, and they're going to be, bringing in that money not because they were, targeting you personally, but because you're one of the numbers that happen to be caught up. Another term that I've heard, and I can't remember if I heard it on movies or if it's just because of what I do, rootkit.
That is a popular one in crime shows or movies, anything that has to do with technology. Basically, a rootkit is generally a seriously advanced piece of malware. It's designed to take complete control over an infected computer at the highest level. It has access to everything on the system, and it modifies that system to make it look like everything is hunky-dory. You could, you think, oh, something's running on my system that I'm not expecting. I'll look in Activity Monitor. It's not going to show up there. You might know a little bit more about Unix, so you open up a terminal and you run a command to list the running processes. It's not going to show up there either. They basically hide it so well that the system itself acts like everything is fine, even though it's not. The name comes from Unix. I guess the most privileged user account on Unix is root. So rootkit has full access to everything, just like the root account on Unix has. So that's where the name comes from. But it's, I wouldn't say that it's a non-existent threat. It's not as common a piece of malware as some of the others on this list. It's definitely not as common as Adware, but it does exist for the various operating systems, for Unix operating systems, for Linux, for earlier versions of Mac OS. The code is definitely floating around out there, so it's something that can be encountered from time to time, but you probably won't run across it in your normal day-to-day surfing of the web.
It's more for if you're a system administrator, you're running those Unix servers, is where you see it more, where they gain access to the computer and then they install their backdoor, giving them access to it at a later time. Again, Mac has the whole Unix core to it, so you have that functionality available for it. There are rootkits for the Mac.
The scary thing with rootkits, because of the way they work with modifying the system, it's not something that your antivirus program can just delete a single file and your system's clean. almost always with rootkits, you need to do a complete reinstall of your operating system, restore all of your files from a backup. That's known to be a good, non-infected backup. You can't trust anything on the system once you've been infected with a rootkit. It's kind of what's considered game over as far as the system security goes.
Definitely one of the hardest to get back from, yeah.
Is that hardware that you end up walking away from then? And then follow-up question, how good is my backup at that point? Like, let's say I've gone and, I don't know, my Mac has fallen victim to this vulnerability or to some ne'er-do-well using whatever you call rootkit use. But then I go out and I buy a new Mac, let's say, worst case scenario, and then I run my backup to get all my information back on it. Have I just now ported that back into my new Mac?
Yeah, that's one of those things where you really have to be sure you've got a safe backup, and there's no easy answer to that one. No, it really isn't. A lot of times when you're talking rootkits in a corporate environment, there are specific companies that do forensics, computer forensics, and will figure out when it first was introduced in the system, so they can figure out when they can't count on backups from that time period forward. As far as the hardware itself goes, you wouldn't need to replace the hardware. You could wipe the hard drive, or if you feel better about it, pitch the hard drive out the window and buy a new hard drive. But the rest of the hardware on your Mac is still fine. It all resides in software, at least for what we're talking about here. So that would be a bit of an extreme step to buy a brand new computer.
I'm an extreme guy, Nick.
I'm sure Apple will thank you, buying new hardware every time.
So here's one that sounds really cool and exciting, and I would actually, back in the day, might have gotten excited if I'd heard this in a movie. Spyware sounds like something maybe sort of James Bondy, something along those lines, but it's not nearly as cool.
Well, spyware is definitely, it's cool from a security research side of things. So the whole goal of spyware is to spy on a user. While a keystroke logger records everything that's typed in a keyboard, spyware goes further to collect data. It could take screenshots of what you're doing on the computer. It can record a video session or even the entire screen. It could monitor what you're doing on the internet, anything you're doing on the user, and all this could be sent back to a malicious third party.
So it's like a keylogger on steroids. Keyloggers are definitely a component of spyware. Spyware kind of goes above and beyond what a simple keylogger could do.
Next up on the list, this feels like an oldie but a goodie somehow. Trojan horse. That feels like one of the earliest pieces of malware or earliest forms of malware that we all heard about.
It definitely is one that is in the public knowledge as far as how much it's been in the news or on television or movies. Obviously named after the mythological counterpart. It arrives disguised as something you might want, a game or an app, and when you go to run it, nothing happens, or an error message appears, and it turns out it did something bad in the background. You thought you were running a game, and you were really installing a Trojan horse, which could then do a bunch of different things on your system. It could be installing a keylogger. It could be stealing data and sending it out remotely. It could be downloading other types of malware. They're kind of flexible in that regard, and they form the basis of a lot of different malware infections. A lot of times they are found these days on illegal file sharing sites. You think you're about to pirate that new video game, and it's really a Trojan horse. It's a good reason to stay away from those types of download sites or torrent sites, and purchase your software legitimately in the App Store or from trusted developers. It's it's one of those things where, okay, if somebody was looking for pirated software, maybe they deserve what they were getting, but at the same time, if a kid is downloading it on the family computer, it's not fair to the rest of the family that they infected the computer. So they're still probably one of the more well-known and popular pieces of malware, and a fairly decent chance you might run into one in your daily use. Just
so I'm clear, though, a Trojan isn't necessarily the malware itself, right? It's almost like a delivery mechanism. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's still a lot of times it will be used as the description for the malware, but it definitely has a lot of the different categories kind of are fluid in a sense that they share some traits with the others. And this is one of those cases where it's describing the delivery mechanism, that it's coming in disguised as something else versus something that's automatically infecting you without any interaction. You have to go ahead and download and run the program, or download the email attachment from somebody you think you trust. It's definitely the name obviously describes more of the initial behavior than the capabilities in this case.
And a lot of the distribution for these Trojan horses are coming from hacked websites. So you're searching Google for something. You're trying to figure out where to watch that sports game, and you run into a website that says, "Here, you can watch this. All you need to do is install this codec on your machine in order to view the video file." All right, so you go ahead, download it, you install it. Where's that video file? Wait, what did I just install on my computer? What did I give permission? And I know I typed that administrative password right there. So you don't know exactly what's going on there. What you thought was going to happen isn't what happened there. That's when you start to worry.
A good example of that would be fairly recently, Transmission. For OS X, their website was hacked briefly, and a Trojan horse version of the program was distributed. And that one actually, I believe the Trojan ran the first time you ran the program, and then it would make everything look normal. It would replace the actual program back in where it's supposed to be on your system. But that was definitely a case where you think you're downloading something and you end up with something else entirely. And that was, it wasn't people looking for pirated software. Transmission's a BitTorrent client, but it was still, in that case, people were downloading a legitimate program from a legitimate website that just happened to be hacked and was distributing a Trojan horse.
Well, malware is actually a catch-all phrase for malware, I suppose. Well, malware is sort of a catch-all phrase for something bad that is actually being done to your online security or to your security. Virus is one that we tend to use as a catch-all, but it's not. What's the actual definition of virus?
Well, again, like the real-world counterpart, viruses infect otherwise innocent files, modify those files so they can self-replicate and help them spread. They're the oldest form of malware, which is pretty much the reason that everybody thinks everything's a virus, because it's been used for years to describe all different types of malware. The reason why we differentiate and we don't call everything a virus is because not every piece of malware can self-replicate like a virus can. So that is one reason why the security industry as a whole has been moving to use malware as the catch-all rather than virus, just because it's a more accurate term to use. These days, it's pretty rare to actually see a true computer virus in the wild. They're kind of a relic of days in the past more than anything else. So it's, again, not quite an accurate term to use anymore, which is, again, why we switched to malware.
And it feels like a malware term that's about as old as virus is worm.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we still do see worms. Where computer viruses will spread from file to file, worms do the same thing, self-replicate, but spread from computer to computer across a network, either a local network at your home or business, or the internet at large. So in addition to their goal of infecting as many computers as possible, worms are generally used by the bad guys to create botnets where hundreds of thousands or millions of infected machines are acting under the control of the the bad guy who infected them in the first place, and then they can use that botnet to basically participate in a variety of malicious activities. Take your pick. Sending spam or taking down websites. It's basically as old as it is, worms are still definitely a threat that sees action in the real world. You might not encounter it in terms of something that you're on your Mac, I should say. You're not as likely to encounter a worm on your Mac, but it definitely is something that can still affect other machines or devices on the internet.
So let me ask you really quickly, because you said earlier that there's Well, I mean, it sounds to me like a piece of malware that you get can actually be more than one thing. I mean, if I get a virus, is it just going to be a virus? If I get a Trojan horse, well, the Trojan horse is a good example, actually. We talked about the fact that the Trojan horse is actually one thing that's delivering another thing. I mean, are all of these just one thing and I can just eliminate this one thing and be fine? Or do they kind of morph into other things as well?
Basically, when a security company discovers a piece of malware and categorizes it or names it, they will pick the most prominent category, the one that best reflects the capabilities and behavior. But sometimes, as you said, it doesn't necessarily fit nicely into one single category. In those instances, the malware is referred to as a hybrid or blended threat, which basically just means it shares traits from various different types.
So your Trojan horse could be installing your adware and your ransomware and doing multiple aspects of it. You could get your keystroke logger all in one.
And sometimes it does happen where something really doesn't fit in any one category at all, and the security firms will just call it malware. It's easier just to use the generic term than to try and force it into a category that it doesn't necessarily fully fit into. So square peg, round hole, instead of doing that, they'll just go for a generic description.
Okay, so now we have some of our basic terminology down, but let's go back. As I said at the beginning of the show, we're going to end by going back to the beginning. How did this start? Give us a brief history of malware, I suppose.
Okay, well, earlier in the show, we said that you probably wouldn't encounter a virus as often as some of the other types of malware, and there's a reason for that, and that is because malware is a product of its environment. Basically, depending on the situation, the type of hardware or network, the malware authors will basically write malware that fits the specific need at that time. So looking back over the years, the form, functionality, purpose of malware has evolved, basically to match those changes that we've seen as the computer evolution has marched ever forward. Originally, way back in the day, we're talking 30 plus years ago, a lot of the malware was just created as a joke or a prank. It wouldn't do anything more than maybe pop up a message saying happy birthday or something like that. It wasn't deleting files. It wasn't stealing your or locking your files and holding ransom. It was more of a lighthearted time. Whereas now the criminals are using it for cybercrime on a massive scale. Governments are using them for digital weapons. Times have changed. But an interesting kind of aspect that comes as a surprise for some people is the role that Apple played back in the early days of malware development. Because one of the first viruses that targeted home computers, personal computers, was the Elk cloner virus, which was back in 1981, 1982. The exact time period is a bit blurry there. And it targeted Apple II machines, way back in the day. That one was written by a high schooler as a prank, and it spread by infecting floppy disks, which were used to boot those Apple II machines, and thus were shared between computers. So in that case, it was written with a purpose and kind of fitting the time and technology. Later on in, I believe, 1988, the Morris worm was unleashed, and that was the first computer worm that kind of hit the mainstream news and was attacking public systems. The guy who wrote it said that the purpose was he wanted to map the size of the internet, but there was a bug in his code, and it took down a bunch of the internet instead, and he got in trouble and had to pay fines. Again, it was a product of its environment. The computers back then forming the early internet were based on Unix operating systems, and his worm exploited some bugs in Unix operating systems, which is why it was able to spread and take down so many systems, because that was mostly what made up the internet at the time. Then obviously, time marched forward, malware adapted. Into the 90s and 2000s, more and more people started using personal computers. Keyloggers and Trojan horses started appearing more frequently. When more and more people had access to ubiquitous broadband connections, always on internet, adware started appearing. more recently, Stuxnet and Flame were two of those cyber weapons that were used a few years ago, disrupting nuclear reactor, nuclear weapon projects, whatever you want to call it. So that was a case of government weaponizing malware. And then more recently, this year even, ransomware is kind of the big one, where advances in file encryption have enabled digital extortion. So while we might not be able to predict exactly what the next security threat is going to be, looking back, we can see that this evolution of malware has matched the times and technology. So obviously, going forward, it will kind of continue. So as technology advances, so will malware.
Apparently what I'm doing today is speaking in cartoon speak. Not only did G.I. Joe say that knowing is half the battle, but Schoolhouse Rock taught us that knowledge is power. And we've got a little bit more. We're actually only halfway through. Be sure and join us next week as we continue our exploration of the common security terminology and acronyms that you might encounter when malware reports hit the news and hopefully don't hit you. Hey, don't forget, if you want to see, be able to sort of refresh yourself on some of this information, we do have a website that we would love for you to check out, securemac.com/checklist. And if you have a specific question, a concern, a comment that you would like to send our way, we have an email address as well. That is checklist@securemac.com. Checklist@securemac.com. And if you have trouble remembering that, just remember this. You are listening to The Checklist by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.